Hi again. Let's talk about the parasympathetic ganglia. There are four ganglia that you need to be familiar with. So these are ganglia of parasympathetic pathways. So you know that there have to be two neurons in the pathway and that they synapse in the ganglion. So here are the four on the slide. And this is important for you to learn this material as soon as possible. It will make the rest of it a lot easier. This is sort of foundational for a lot of what we're going to be talking about. So if you get this down now, that will make life easier as we go on. If the student continues to struggle with this, life is more difficult. That's all we're going to do in this lecture are these four ganglia, these four parasympathetic pathways. These are the only four that we're looking at in this course. So remember that these parasympathetic fibers are running through cranial nerves. So, for example, cranial nerve 3, the oculomotor, remember we said that the oculomotor was motor only. Well, it's carrying somatic motor fibers to 4 of the extrinsic eye muscles to move the eyeball around in the socket, in the orbit, but it's also carrying parasympathetic fibers that are going to synapse in the ganglion, in the ciliary ganglion, and then the postganglionic fibers are going to go out to the eyeball, and specifically that smooth muscle which causes the pupil to constrict. So constriction of the pupil and exposure to bright light is the result of the parasympathetic pathways going to those smooth constrictor muscles. The next one is from cranial nerve 7. Actually, the second and the third are both from cranial nerve 7. So the facial nerve gives off several branches, 2 parasympathetic pathways. One of those pathways has a synapse in the pterygopalatine ganglion, which we spent some time figuring out where that was. It was in the pterygopalatine fossa. And the postganglionic fibers in that pathway, leaving the ganglion, go out to the lacrimal gland. We'll draw pictures of this in the next slide. Another parasympathetic pathway from the facial nerve synapses in the submandibular ganglion. Under the mandible, those postganglionic fibers innervate the sublingual and the submandibular salivary glands. So again, this is parasympathetic. We're going to either smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, not shown here, or glands. And the last one is the glossopharyngeal nerve, which carries parasympathetic fibers to the otic ganglion by the ear for otic, and that innervates the parotid salivary gland. So those are the four. So let's take a look at an illustration of those. So here is the brainstem. The pons and the medulla. We don't really care about those nuclei, but I just indicated those cranial nerves, 3, 7, and 9 are the ones of interest. So here's 3, which is going off and synapsing in the ciliary ganglion. This is in the orbit of the eye, and it is innervating the iris and ciliary muscle for accommodation, but it's the iris that I just mentioned. So what's going on in the iris? This is smooth muscle in the iris. So yeah, these are the constrictors. Constrictors for the pupil. So if we just pause for just a moment and think about a stimulus response loop for the eyeball, you go out from inside out into a bright sunny day, lots of sunlight, and you know that your pupils constrict. Well, you walk out of the house, the eyeballs pick up extra sunlight, which travels through the optic nerve, so that's the sensory pathway, back to the brain. The brain processes it, says, oh, well, let's constrict the pupil, so it sends out motor fibers. There's our stimulus response loop, and the motor fibers go out to the parasympathetic, through the parasympathetic pathway to that smooth muscle, causes the pupil to constrict. Okay, moving on. Cranial nerve 7, two pathways shown here, and first pathway, synapses in the pterygopalatine ganglion, and the postganglionic fibers run to the lacrimal gland, and this figure is also showing that some of those parasympathetic fibers run to glandular tissue in the nasal mucosa, which makes your nose run. I'm not dealing with that in this class, so you can forget about that. We're going to be dealing with the lacrimal gland. The other pathway for 7, synapses in the submandibular ganglion, and goes to the sublingual and the submandibular salivary glands. And when that pathway is active, we secrete saliva. The largest of the salivary glands is the parotid salivary gland. And those fibers are carried by cranial nerve 9, the glossopharyngeal synapsing in the otic ganglion. Okay, let's go to the next slide and just practice drawing this. I would practice this. Make up your own. Pretty soon you should be able to draw your own ganglia, your own effectors on the right, and something for the CNS. So let's go ahead and identify these nuclei in the CNS as the nuclei for cranial nerve 3, and let's make this one for the facial, and number 9, the glossopharyngeal. So those are the nuclei where the parasympathetic motor pathways begin. So let's do the first one. So the parasympathetic pathway for the oculomotor, you know that it runs out. We have to have 2 neurons, right? So there's a 2 neuron pathway. There's the first one. And then here's the cell body. And it runs out something like that. Okay? So, review time. What's the neurotransmitter that is released from this preganglionic neuron? The neurotransmitter, right, would be ACH. And what kind of receptor is on the postganglionic cell? What kind of receptor is over here on that cell? Yeah, it's going to be nicotinic. I'll just abbreviate it as NIC. And you remember while we're at it, you remember the neurotransmitter. This is all parasympathetic. The neurotransmitter for the postganglionic cell. Yeah, good. It was also ACH. onto what kind of receptor? On the smooth muscle of the iris that's going to cause contraction. Yeah, it was muscarinic receptor. And then you should be able to tell me what the response is for this pathway. This would cause pupillary dilation or pupillary constriction. Pupillary constriction. So here's a question. What do you think would happen if you drugged the eyeballs and you administered a drug that, let's say, blocked these receptors? What do you think would happen? Would you go blind or what? That's what happens when you go into the eye doctor for an eye exam and they dilate your eyes. They put a little drug in the eye drops that temporarily blocks those receptors, right? Pupils can't constrict, but you have dual innervation going to that muscle. The sympathetic fibers, which we're not drawing, are still active and they cause dilation. So you just removed one half of that antagonistic relationship. Okay, moving on. Let's do facial. And here's our preganglionic again. Same neurotransmitter, same receptor story. Oh, we didn't write in the name of the ganglion. So for the oculomotor pathway, it's a ciliary ganglion. I'll abbreviate ganglion as gang. And here we are in the pterygopalatine ganglion. For your pathways, when you're practicing this, don't get hung up necessarily drawing in the neurotransmitters and the receptors. You should be able to do that if you're asked, but I wouldn't do that every time you see the chance, if you have it down. And the postganglionic fiber, again, goes to the lacrimal gland. And what would be the anticipated response? I'd like you to be thinking about responses. Yeah, increased tears. Lacrimal fluid. Maybe you got a bug in the eye or something, or a piece of dust. Try to flush it out. Okay, so we also have fibers leaving 7, another pathway, and this is going to the submandibular ganglion. Submandibular gang. So there's the axon terminal. And let's make this the sublingual gland, salivary gland. And let's make this one the submandibular. And we have to put in a second pathway, a second neuron, so let's do something like this. And we'll hook another one up. you go there. Okay, have one more to do. And this this is 9, and I forgot that I was going to do branches. So this is a branch of 9, and this is the lesser petrosal nerve. And this is going to the otic ganglion. It's by the ear. And the postganglionic fibers run to the parotid salivary gland. And since this is all parasympathetic, it's rest and digest, and all of these glands will be increasing. What is that? Looks like salad or something. Parotid salivary gland. I can't write and talk at the same time. Okay? And this is the lesser petrosal nerve. Oops. This is the greater petrosal nerve. You will not have to identify those in pictures. Okay, that you need to practice until you get it. So I made a sheet for you on the next page, and here you can practice drawing. I'm going to leave it blank for you. Practice drawing the 4 parasympathetic pathways. So I'd probably do something quick and easy, something like this. There's your CNS. Here's your nucleus, and maybe you're going off to the eyeball. You can do it sort of something like that, and you know that you need to synapse in the ciliary ganglion. So identify it, and then talk about the response. And you're good. Okay? 2 neuron pathway. These are parasympathetic. It's motor. And then when you do 7 and 9, you can mention or include the greater and lesser petrosal nerves. Okay, that's all that there is for this. But I would probably not go past this point in the lecture until you can write out the names and numbers of all 12 cranial nerves, whether they're mixed, motor only, sensory only, and then briefly where they go and what they do, as we did before. You can be brief on the description and the target and what they do. But I would have that down pretty solid, and I'd have these parasympathetic pathways down pretty solid. It'll make things smoother as we go on. Okay? So good luck. Please ask questions when you have them, and I'll chat with you in Zoom. Bye.